Hello everybody, Andy Smith here. I am very excited about this video because I think it's a somewhat unique idea and I think it's going to be super fun. Today I am going to be doing 25 fantasy series that I want to read. And I want to tell you two reasons that I decided to do this video, which I haven't seen a whole lot around BookTube. First, like a lot of people, some of my favorite videos to watch are people's top 5 or top 10 fantasy of all time. I love those videos and they're very, very fun to watch, and I will continue to watch them, and I will surely put one out at some point in this channel's history or at multiple points. But if you're like me and you sort of binge those, you sort of notice after watching a handful of them that they go over the same like 5 to 15 series, which is understandable. Things like A Song of Ice and Fire and Harry Potter and Wheel of Time and, you know, the well-known book series are the ones that people go to first, which is good, which is great. I would recommend people to do that. But oftentimes I feel like new fantasy readers, or even people who have known they liked fantasy for a while, once they're done with those series, they don't really know where they want to go, or if they want to read other fantasy, or if there's anything else that is like those series. And as I have read more and more fantasy series, I have learned to branch out. Again, not because I don't like those initial series, but there's only so many times you can reread Malazan or whatever it is. So I am going to do a top 25 fantasy series right now in 2020 that I really want to read. And hopefully it will bring some attention to some series that you haven't read or are interested in as well. That brings me to my second reason for doing this, and that is I am in the blessed position where I have somewhat of an audience on YouTube that can help direct my reading, because obviously I want to be reading the best fantasy. So I'm basically telling you 25 series that I'm looking at reading, and in the comments, if you're good with it, help me decide in what order, which ones I should really prioritize, which ones maybe you think, despite me hearing about them, I shouldn't read and are not very good. I want to hear your opinions on these books. I want to know if I really should read them or not, because again, I haven't read any of these. I'm not including, by the way, as a caveat, any series that I'm currently reading. So like Dresden Files isn't in there, despite me reading them, Stormlight Archive, despite me currently reading them. Like, I have to have not touched any of these series to be on this list. And without further ado, let's get into it. Now, these are not numbered in any particular way. I'm just numbering them so that we can keep track of how many I've said. However, the one caveat is the 5 final ones I'm mentioning are ones that I am going to be reading soon, like in the next 6 months or so. So if you're kind of anxiously waiting one, it's probably towards the end of the video. But first, let's start out on this list. First up, the Band series, the first book of which is Kings of the Wyld, Wyld spelt with a Y, so you know it's a little Norse inspired, I'm assuming, by Nicholas Eames. I am very excited about this for a couple of reasons. First off, this book was the first book that one of my fans gave to me off of my Amazon wish list. So thank you so much, Michael or Mikkel. I'm not sure exactly how you say that, but it means the world to me that you're so interested in me reading something that you would buy it for me. On the bottom of each of my videos, I include my Amazon wish list link, and you can click that, and if you're so inclined, no pressure at all, you can buy a book off of that you know I want to read, including all of the books that are on this list, and it will come to me. So the best way to get me to read something is to buy it for me, because sometimes it's hard to get a hold of these things. But Michael, thank you so much for doing that. I'm excited to get into this. I've seen a lot of chatter around BookTube about it, and it is the cover is just gorgeous, and the quality of the printing as well. Also, another huge reason I want to get in on this is I posted an Instagram picture when I got this because I was so excited about getting my first fan-bought books. Look at me, I look so excited. Don't you want me to feel that excited? Anyway, Nicholas Eames actually commented on it, which I think is so cool. Anytime that an author is willing to interact with his audience like that just makes me that much more excited to read it. So I'm very much looking excited to do this. There right now are 2 books in it. The other one is called Bloody Rose. It's like an old mercenary band after their heyday getting together for basically like one last ride. There's also something interesting about it being based on like classic rock groups. I don't know enough about that to talk to it, but I think it's kind of a quirky idea. But originality in fantasy is always welcome. So the band series. Number 2, this will come as a shock to no one, but the Ian Esslemont books on the Malazan Empire. He has 2 separate series right now that he's working on. The novels of the Malazan Empire series, as well as the Path to Ascendency. If you don't know, Steven Erikson and Ian Esslemont, I believe, were graduate roommates, or at least very, very close friends for a long time, and they developed this fantasy world together. And while the Malazan Book of the Fallen is sort of the standard for that world, Esslemont also does a lot of really great, interesting stories. I've heard, I haven't read them obviously, around that story, and also his own stories in the world as a whole. So really excited to pick these up. It's so rare to have a fantasy world created by 2 people equally and for them to have different voices and styles within that world. Oftentimes you have like one author create something and then like a bunch of people sort of spin off from that initial tale, or it's like this wider universe where they just hire people, you know, like the Star Wars or Star Trek universe, and do lots of different ones. This is somewhere in the middle where it's not just one author coming up with it, but it's also not just like a group or owned by a corporation, but it's these 2 guys that are really co-partners and co-creators. I'm excited. It's not going to surprise anyone that I'm excited to read more Malazan. Number 3, The Last King of Osten Ard by Tad Williams. So Tad Williams, I feel like, is a too well-kept secret in the fantasy circles. He did a fantasy series back in the 90s called Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Actually, I think I have part 2 of the 3rd book in that trilogy, to Green Angel Tower by Tad Williams. He is an absolutely phenomenal writer. At times, in my opinion, he struggles with focusing on what should be focused on, and his pacing somewhat struggles. But I still love the way he writes. His characters are fascinating. He will frustrate you in the best possible way, meaning like his stories, kind of Robin Hobb-like, don't just go the way that they should go, or doesn't go the way the heroes want it to go. But I like that in a story. I think that's really fun trope subversion, but not just for trope subversion's sake, but for like honesty to the story. And so this is his new trilogy in the Osten Ard Trilogy, or the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn world. It's been like 20 or 30 years he's going back to it, and I think he, by doing that, is definitely going back for a purpose. So I'm really excited to get back into this world and to see if over those 20, 30 years, some of the negatives I found in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, he has become more mature in as an author. And I'm just interested to see it. So The Witchwood Crown is the first book in that series. I already have it. I'm excited to get going and to see what this is like. And this doesn't count as a separate book, but his War of the Flowers book is also another fantasy that I really want to get into because I really like his readings. That's a standalone, it's not a series, so I didn't include it on this list, but very excited to get into these characters and Simon once again. A 4th series I'm very excited to get into is the Age of Madness Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is where I'm going to let you as my audience in on a little dirty secret about me. I read the Blade Itself Trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, a highly praised series, both critically and with audiences of fantasy literature, and I was not a huge fan. I know, I'm so sorry. I do agree that some of the character work was really interesting. I love how unique it was and how it was willing to go into some darker places in a organic way, not just for darkness's sake that I think some grim dark artists do. I do agree it was funny and witty at times, but I just found the plot itself rather grating and didn't really go anywhere, and overall was not a huge fan. I finished the series, definitely didn't DNF it, but so I'm sorry. I know there's gonna be a lot of fans out there. I think I'm gonna do a review of it at some point to talk more specifically about some of the problems I had, especially with beloved characters like Glodka, who I agree was good in some ways, but not good in other ways. That's not for this video, but all that to say is I'm interested to see his new trilogy to see how I compare it to the Blade itself. Because as I said, there's a lot of great stuff in that first trilogy that I liked, even though overall I wasn't a huge fan. And so in a different setting, if you don't know, this new trilogy, The Age of Madness, takes place, I think, during like the industrialization of his original world. I don't know if there's a name for his world yet. Let me know in the comments if there is. But I'm very interested to see how his style changes, how he wants to tell this new era and new story. So even though I wasn't a huge fan of that first one, I still recognize Abercrombie is a good writer, and I'm really interested to jump back in to some of his stuff, especially his newer stuff. Number 5, Jade City or Jade War. I don't remember the actual name of the series, but the one by Fonda Lee. This has gotten a ton of coverage recently on BookTube if you follow the fantasy BookTube community. It's this gangster-like fantasy tale where Jade, the actual like precious stone, gives certain skills and magic in the world, and so possessing it is really power in this world, and it's owned by these sort of gangster mobs of some kind, or mafia families that give the world its shape. And so I'm very interested in this trilogy because I've heard, or it's not a trilogy, this series, I've heard a lot of good things about it. It was just included on like Time's top 100 fantasy of all time. So I'm just really excited to get into this. I try not to learn a lot besides like basic reviews and feelings before I read these things, but it's definitely got enough clout for me to be excited to read it. And now for this 6th series, I'm gonna go to a very old series, the Drizzt Trilogy, or I think what it's officially called is the Dark Elf Trilogy. This follows Drizzt. It's written by R.A. Salvatore. This is way back in sort of the OG trilogies of the Forgotten Realms series as a whole. I have never read any Forgotten Realms. I know, I'm sorry. I know a lot about the world because I played D&D, especially a lot of 5th edition. So I know and love the world, and I'm familiar with some basic stuff like Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate and a couple other things, but never read any of the works. And I have heard from a lot of people, this is the place to jump in. It's part of that classic fantasy tradition. I'm excited to get going and learn about this series and Drizzt, this character that has been so influential on the generation of fantasy authors that I love and have read growing up. So super pumped to get into this. I definitely want to get on this trilogy soon. The basic story, I believe, is Drizzt is a dark elf, a drow, which is also very exciting because those aren't really covered normally in a lot of fantasy worlds. And it's about his homeland and sort of the hopelessness of that race, but trying to, I think, sort of inspire them. I don't know exactly past then, because again, I'm not trying to find out more, but I'm excited to check this out. 7, another classic series that I've never read, The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks. This is in the tradition of like Lord of the Rings like spins on the fantasy genre back when really Lord of the Rings was the only like popularly accepted modern fantasy work, and so a lot of the works that were being published were basically like trying to be almost Lord of the Ring-esque as far as I understand, and The Sword of Shannara is kind of in that tradition. And I really want to read it just because it is so important to the genre. It's 3 semi-shortish books, so it shouldn't be too hard, or maybe 4 books. Shouldn't be too hard to get going, but I just love reading the OGs, and like, I'm guessing like most of those works, they have great prose and are super well written, even if maybe the elements of the story are not super original. Number 8, this is going back to newer series, and that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I'm excited about this for a lot of different reasons. First off, it's written from an Asian perspective about a lot of clashes in the ancient East, which is a style that at least in Western fantasy we're not often privy to, especially from a perspective of someone who's from and knows intimately that culture like R.F. Kuang. I'm excited it's from a female perspective. I'm excited it's from a young person's perspective, someone from my generation now being accepted and publishing fantasy. So a lot of different reasons I'm excited about it. I know that because I've watched a lot of reviews, there's somewhat contrasting opinions on how people like this trilogy. So again, I am excited to jump into this, especially the newest one, the 3rd one, The Burning God, is coming out soon. So I'm super pumped. Yay, Poppy War. 9 is the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. This, I know, is a hugely popular series for those people who really like Brandon Sanderson. Because I'm going through the Stormlight Archive, you guys know I have mixed feelings on Brandon Sanderson, where I love some of his storytelling and the elements of his story, but I really don't like his writing style and sort of the thinner themes in a lot of his works, at least how I interpret them. And I think Brent Weeks is going to be similar, But again, I've heard that his story elements, especially his magic system in the Lightbringer series, are so original and so cool that I want to read it and decide for myself. I know also that the ending of this fantasy series is really divisive among its fans, and I actually really like that. Normally, when endings are divisive, that means I think the author was rather brave, and is generally going to mean that I like them. I'm one of those weird people who like the ending of Lost. So I'm excited for a lot of those reasons. All right, prepare yourself for some Robin Hobb love, because that is coming. In fact, originally I did all 3 series in the Realms of the Elderlings that I have not read yet, but I kind of cheated and combined 2 of them because I thought a little unfair to just give one author all 3 of them. But if you don't know my thoughts about Robin Hobb, I think she is an incredible author, one of the best out there. I don't know especially why her Live Ship Traders trilogy is not talked about as some of the best of all time. Check out my Ship of Magic rave review. I'll link it up above if you haven't, because she is so good. So Tawny Man Trilogy, and number 10 and number 10A is going to be the Wyld Chronicles, and then 10B is going to be the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. So again, I'm just straight up cheating there, to be honest. I thought 25 would be a nice round number rather than 26, but I needed to say all the Robin Hobb series that I haven't read in the Realm of the Elderlings. If you don't know, she has a world that is sort of broadly called the Realm of the Elderlings, but she doesn't write them, at least so far, in such a way where you have to read them in chronological order, like these 16 books, but they're in like small little chunks that are different parts of the world that sort of connect, but like you don't need them, it's not necessary. So Live Ship Traders and Farseer Trilogy are the 2 that I've read and are phenomenal, and I just want to read them so badly. I don't know why more people don't talk about Robin Hobb. She's amazing. Read all of her stuff. Number 12 is a series I don't actually know a whole lot about, except I was recommended it a lot by Alan at the Library of Alexandria, and that is the Greatcoats Series by Sebastian de Castell, and I am excited. Like I said, I don't really know a lot about this, except that it's raved about by people who I trust. I think it has sort of a swashbuckling, almost musketeer-like feel to it, a little later than most middle-aged sword and sorcery fantasy. I just heard a lot about how good the characters are and how good the sort of political intrigue at like a grassroots level this is, and that's sort of my shit, so excited for that. 13, this is probably one of the most recommended series to me that I haven't touched at all, and that is Discworld by Sir Terry Pratchett. He's been knighted, I believe. Most of you out there probably at least know what Discworld is. It's sort of an absurdist fantasy series that again is sort of not linear at all, but a lot of different sort of smaller series that are about various characters in sort of this odd, crazy world. It's sort of like, from my understanding, the fantasy version of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, in that it takes a lot of the tropes and things from fantasy and does some very interesting and hilarious twists on it. And often in very smart ways. Reading through the internet and recommendations for the series, a lot of people say don't start at the first one, but start at some other points. I will probably start at Guards. Again, this is a recommendation from Alan. I trust his recommendation. Absurdism is not really my jam normally, but I often am impressed by it, if not enjoy it as much as some other people, and so I will definitely, because of its importance, have to give it a try. Number 14 is an interesting series because I have never heard of it until another one of my friends, Chris Bookish Cauldron, started reading this, and I highly recommended it, especially for a beautifully written fantasy work, and that is the Swans War Series by Sean Russell. And I've just not heard of this, but again, this shows the power of a recommendation from people you trust, and what I think is great about BookTube is that I find these new friends and they recommend me things I haven't heard of, but also I think this is a victory of book design. I mean, the book cover, just look at that. It is gorgeous. Love it, and it just makes you want to read. This is, I think, One Kingdom. I mean, you guys obviously know, but Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly. And then Isle of Battle. I now have both on Kindle, which is kind of sad because it's such a beautiful book cover that now I have to just look at an electronic screen. But it was enough to make me want to read the book. And I think this is a pretty standard epic fantasy in the fact of like it's kingdoms and there's wars and characters involved in that. But I just hear it's so beautifully written that I'm excited to get into it. And Chris, you need to follow his channel. He's amazing and I really trust him implicitly. So he's the one who first turned me on to Robin Hobb's Ship of Magic as something that I need to read, and he was completely right. So he's got my trust. At 15, we have The War for the Rose Throne by Peter McLean. I think that's how you say that last name. A lot of wars going on. I guess this is fantasy and it's not too surprising. This is a fantasy that was recommended to me by Mike at Book Reviews. I don't know much about it except it's one of the many series that are compared with A Song of Ice and Fire. Sort of a larger clashing of different kingdoms and families to gain control of a region. Again, I don't really know much about this except that it's been spoken of highly by a couple of people that I trust. And I really like this kind of fantasy, so goes on the list. 16, The Faithful and the Fallen, the first book of which is Malice by John Gwynne. This is another series that it has been popping up all over the place on Fantasy BookTube, and as I like to be well read in the genre and to kind of stay up with what people are talking about, I want to dip into it, and I've heard a lot of conflicting things about this, which actually always makes me excited about a series when there's people who love it and then people some criticism, because it gives you sort of an unsuredness going into it, and it also does take down the expectations to where I feel like I can rationally go into it, if that makes sense. Like anyone who's reading Game of Thrones for the first time, the book Game of Thrones, I know it's called A Song of Ice and Fire, but the first one is called Game of Thrones, like they're gonna have high expectations because of the oeuvre of the culture, but I like going into something that, for me, I know there's at least some mixed feelings upon, so that I feel like I can have a unique opinion and don't have to like see what other people see in it. I don't know if I'm rambling here, if that makes sense to you guys, but Malice feels like sort of a mix of grimdark and classic fantasy as far as I understand it. And yeah, some people really love it and some people are not huge fans of it. So I'm excited to draw my own conclusions. 17, The Moontide Quartet by David Hare, or maybe David Heyer. I don't know if you pronounce that in the German way. I think this series is a great example of how a single concept can really sell a series to somebody. So this is another high epic fantasy, but the basis of it is that once every 100 years, or I forget the exact amount of time, but every so often in this long period of time, a land bridge, because of the cycles of the moon, is desubmerged, or I guess the water dissipates from and causes a land bridge between two continents. And so whenever that happens, it's called the Moontide. There is this epic, crazy war between these two nations on the continent. And this just follows one of those such wars. I just think that's a super cool concept and I want to see it executed. That's really it. I just read that, or I forget if it was a review that I read or someone recommended it to me or I saw some video on it, but like, that's a cool idea. I want to read it. Number 18 is The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. I have heard from a lot of people that this is the closest thing to A Song of Ice and Fire you can find that isn't George R.R. Martin. It's just this really big, epic, sprawling fantasy that takes some influence from the East. And again, I kind of like that unique flavor added into an epic fantasy. So another one of these, just like, this is so my shit, I want to watch it. So excited about that. 19, speaking of things that are in the high fantasy area, this definitely isn't that. This is purposely in another era of our history, and that is the Powder Mage Trilogy by Brian McClellan. This is set in sort of a Napoleonic era. There is gunpowder. I have never read a gunpowder fantasy, or there might be some other fantasy name for it, but I thought this was very interesting. I love history, like actual history, and especially the Napoleonic era, the 19th century, the French Revolution, I'm especially a student of, so I am incredibly intrigued in this system and how magic is incorporated and the Napoleonic military tradition and how that will be dealt with. I've never read that in a fantasy genre. I'm sure it's out there, I just haven't personally experienced it. I'm super excited about picking this up, and again, the book cover is great. Not a lot of fantasy book covers are great. This is another one of them that really draws you in. So excited about the Powder Mage Trilogy. I think the first one is called Promise of Blood. Number 20, again, to no one's surprise, Steven Eriksen's The Kharkanas Trilogy, the first one of which is The Forge of Darkness, and then Fall of Light is the second one. This is so much my shit, so much up my alley. No one is surprised I want to read these. Obviously, I've already bought them and I'm very excited. Steven Eriksen is my favorite fantasy author of all time. I think he's brilliant. And I have heard that these books are actually much more philosophical than the Malazan books, which I find hard to believe, but also I'm super excited by as a student of both the Malazan world and philosophy and Eriksen himself. So excited to read these. I'm probably going to wait till it comes a little closer to the third one it's going to be released, because I think it's going to be a couple of years before then, and I want to be able to sort of swing right from one to the other. So I might not be able to be that patient, but for the moment, that's why this isn't in sort of my reading soon category. Otherwise it would be. I also really want to try out some Steven Eriksen stuff that's not in the Malazan world, specifically Willful Child, which is kind of his Star Trek spin. But there wasn't room on the list past 25, but I'll probably pick those up sort of in between larger books just to kind of give it a try, because again, he's my favorite author. All right, so now we are in not the top 5 or final 5 or whatever, but the 5 that are actually like on my TBRs in the next couple of months, that once I'm done with my current reading series, I am going to pick up and start reading. So not only do I want to show these guys to you, but if you've read them, feel free to give me some like advice on getting ready for these series, what you think of them, because these ones I am definitely going to read. First up, The Witcher series. I actually haven't read The Witcher, which I think is crazy because A, love fantasy, and it's one of the biggest names in fantasy. Probably most people already know this, but The Witcher by Andrzej Sapkowski. I have played like every self-respecting video game player The Witcher 3, loved it, thought it was fantastic, but haven't read any of the Witcher books. So I'm going to definitely bang those out pretty soon. I might do it all in a row because actually they're not that thick, and I'm really excited to give some thoughts about it and then be able to have a little bit more of an opinion on the show itself, especially as it goes towards its latter seasons, and I'm just really excited to read it. I've also heard there's a lot of postmodern elements to The Witcher, which you probably know about me. I'm a big fan of that. So I'm really excited. The Witcher I'm definitely going to pick up very, very soon. 22, The Gentleman Bastards Trilogy, or 4 books. The Gentleman Bastards series, the first of which is The Lies of Loch Lamore by Scott Lynch. This book particularly is so highly praised around BookTube and sounds like such something that I would love that I'm just through the roof excited to get reading this series, and particularly this book. A lot of people say to read this sort of as a standalone, and then if you really like it, then to go on, but don't feel that you need to. Knowing me, I am definitely going to be excited to read past this, but I already have it in my possession, and I love this old cover versus the newer covers that just kind of have a generic boat on them. I'm so excited to get into this. Gentleman Bastards Trilogy, if you don't know, is about a friendship between two kind of thieves, and they are basically surviving in the power politics and underworld politics of a Venice-like city. So, really excited for the Gentleman Bastards. 23 is the Wizard of Earthsea Trilogy by Ursula Le Guin. Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm actually kind of breaking my rules on this because I read most of this, I don't know, like 3-4 years ago, and I remember really, really liking it. But at that point, it was kind of a crazy time in life, and it was one of the few times in my life where I didn't have a lot of time to read fiction. It's a long story that goes into that, but I just wasn't able to sort of get into that because of that time period. So I'm very excited to give it a fair shot now that I'm more settled in life and at a better place. So super excited about getting into this. Again, this is something that a lot of people in the Malazan world recommend as a fellow postmodern viewpoint, and I know Eriksen himself has praised Le Guin on several occasions, and just even way back when I wasn't able to devote my full attention to it, I remember thinking it was beautiful and elegantly written, and I'm really excited to get to these books. The 24th and second to last series that I'm very excited to read is the R. Scott Bakker, The Prince of Nothing Trilogy, which starts out with, I believe, a book called The Darkness That Comes Before. Now, this was actually pretty low on my TBR. I had it, it was kind of in my eye, but a couple people have really recommended it after watching my discussions and what I appreciated from the Malazan world. A lot of people say that Bakker's style, as well as his aesthetic and post-structuralist structure to his, I know that's ironic, story is similar to Malazan, or at least takes some echoes from it. And I know that R. Scott Bakker himself is actually a trained philosopher, I believe, and has even put forward philosophical writings before his fictional works. And so these are something that has really jumped to the top of my TBR thanks to some of you guys out there and being on BookTube. And I haven't seen a lot of chatter about it around BookTube. I think kind of it's like Malazan, where it's kind of a intimidating work, or at least that's what people think of it, and so it's not undertaken as readily as a lot of these other things I've mentioned. But I actually don't know anything about the story itself, and again, I kind of like that. If you've read this, let me know what you think about it. Obviously spoiler free, but I've heard from a lot of people that they think I would like it, and definitely at the very least would like me to pontificate on it. So let me know if you agree with those viewers. 25th and finally, this book series has Steven Erikson's recommendation on the cover, which automatically makes me want to read it. It is also a classic in the fantasy genre, and a lot of people say that it kind of founded, or at least rejuvenated, the grim, dark area of fantasy, which I don't like that term. Joe Abercrombie also doesn't like that term. Steven Erikson doesn't like that term, so I'm not sure if that's a great term, but of course, I'm talking about Glenn Cook's The Black Company. This is like a military personal fantasy that Erikson took a lot of cues from, especially in Bridge Burners and Bone Hunters-esque storytelling in the Malazan world particularly. It sounds like something I would love, and so I'm really excited about this. I think the basic idea is there's this company and this mercenary group called the Black Company, and they have a record keeper of some kind. I think an apologist is what he's called, and he keeps the record of the company through the ages. And the books you're reading are really just the record of what that company has accomplished and done throughout its history. So many elements of that, the viewpoint of history, the militaristic aspect of it, the sort of more boots on the ground way of viewing military fantasy. I imagine that this, kind of the OG of that, I'm really, really gonna love. So that is definitely, like, before the end of the year, I'm gonna read some Black Company books. So there you go. You have my really, really big 25 fantasy book series that I want to get to and want to get to soon. Again, part of the reasons I made this video is so that you guys can tell me what I missed and your thoughts on the books that I've mentioned. What should I read? What should I take up? What do you think of these things? And remember, I'm going to shamelessly say my Amazon wish list is in the bottom if the quickest way to have something rise on my TBR is if it's physically in front of me. So, of course, no pressure. Everyone is in different circumstances, and I don't expect anyone to do that. But hey, free books are free books and are great. Thank you guys for watching. As always, first in, last out.